Well, as Raphael said, I'm Julie Burstein. I used to produce Studio 360, which you may have heard is a radio show on the weekends of WNYC. And it is my great pleasure to have another radio person up here. I do a lot of panels, and usually I was saying it's with scientists and artists, and it's lovely to have somebody else who loves radio up here with me. Brian was drawn to radio by a fellowship, the Kroc Fellowship, which you may have heard of. Public Radio got a big gift from Joan Kroc, who is the widow of the guy who made McDonald's into what it is. And the great thing about this gift is it brought people like Brian into radio. We may learn a little bit about his not really being interested in radio before that happened. But now he is a producer for This American Life, and that is a show I think perfectly suited to this conversation. So, Brian, I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about your experience before you came to radio, because you were in theater in college. How did you find, and we're talking about a theater work that both of us saw parts of, but how do you find the work that you did in theater, does it have relevance to the work that you do as a radio reporter and producer?
Definitely, absolutely, yeah. I mean, first of all, we spend our days writing scripts, so, you know, that in that very basic way, like it is the same work as you know, creating a play, I think. I mean, and at least at our show, we talk with theatrical terms all the time. Like every day we're saying, you know, what scene do we need to do here? And like, all right, what's the order of the scenes here? I mean, we use the phrase, let's bring this person on stage, like every day as well. Like we think very much in terms of the first time that you hear from an interviewee or a character in our story. You know,
it's their entrance.
Yeah, it's their entrance, like how you bringing them on stage, and then once they're on stage, how do they exist? And you have to justify bringing them on stage at all. You can't just have a talking head come on and give the other side of the story. You need to, you know, have them make an entrance and exist as a full character. So like in those ways, like yeah, we use that stuff every day, and just harnessing voice and all sorts of stuff like that.
This American Life does that. I mean, Ira even says scene 1, scene 2, scene 3. Yeah. But in other places, like at National Public Radio, I haven't heard them talk in that way very often.
No, they don't.
In the newsroom,
people talk about scenes. I mean, like getting a scene at NPR means like having natural sound.
Having the
like
sound to set that moment.
What we mean by a scene, I mean, a scene can totally happen solely in writing. I mean, like as long as you're talking about characters doing things and interactions they're having, that's a scene. It doesn't even need to be actual sound even.
So when you were working at NPR, did you find yourself thinking in these ways too, even though everybody in the newsroom was not really talking in that way?
I feel like I was, but didn't know it. I mean, you're creating, you know, a certain product there versus a certain product at our show.
And the tone and the pace is really different.
Yeah, definitely. But I found myself being interested in thinking that way, you know, and wanting to. But it doesn't totally have the same purpose, though sometimes it does, like in the longer pieces.
I'm interested in this idea of people making entrances. So can you tell us about a piece that you're working on or you've worked on how that happens, how you've done all this work, you've interviewed somebody forever and ever. How do you then decide, all right, how are we going to make them make an entrance?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm trying to think of an example. I wish I'd brought tape.
I know, I was thinking about that this morning.
I mean, a simple way, like, you know, like that like Radio Lab does all the time, if you guys listen to that, or like a simple way is like to have like the interviewer and the interviewee like say hi, you know, like like hey, you know, hi Brian, hi Glenn, how's it going? That's like one way to kind of set an interview.
So have like the host say hi to the person who's coming in to do the piece.
So that only usually works if there's some motivation beforehand where you want to hear this interview, you know, that can serve like where you're wanting to hear the interview and then it's starting, hi. You know, but there's a lot of other ways, like to bring someone on stage. I'm trying to think of an example from a recent thing that we worked on. Like, I think I did a story about, I think this is the piece of tape we used. We did a story about a woman who had a mental illness. She had a form of obsessive compulsive disorder where she had to swallow everything she saw, basically. Like she swallowed pens and pencils and radio antenna and like horrible knives, and lived for 12 years in a straitjacket, basically, and still would steal things and find ways to swallow them. And I think the way we brought her on stage, I mean, I knew this going into the interview, I just had her list everything she'd ever swallowed, basically, on tape. And then that's how we brought her on stage. That's how you met this person, was her listing everything she swallowed. And then after that, there's no way of turning it off. Like, you're going to listen to the story of what it was like to swallow these things. And so, you know, like, you kind of try and find the thing that illustrates the person, you know, and there they are, and that makes whet your appetite.
Pulls the audience in, so as you say, you can't turn it off after that, because you want to know, what is this? Although you probably set it up with some sort of narrative beforehand, or did we just hear a list of knives,
some kind
pens?
of thing, like she was obsessed by a thought or something like that, and it made her do, like, it made her swallow things. And then she came in and said something like, I've swallowed a knife, I've swallowed a pencil, like 80 pencils, I've swallowed whatever else. I think that's how we started that. If not, that was originally how we were going to start it.
That's how you wanted to start it.
Yeah. And we found some other way to bring her on stage, but yeah.
You know, you're talking about that. I don't know how many of you saw or are going to see the Nature Theater of Oklahoma. Has anybody seen the Life and Times? So a couple of people. I saw part 1, which is entirely sung, and you saw parts 3 and 4. Mm-hmm. And what it is it's taken from a series of conversations that I think the artistic director, is that right, had with one of the actors of her life, from birth to however old she is now. And one of the things it made me think a lot about is asking questions, because the story that you get from someone can change dramatically depending on the questions that you ask. And so you're talking about this woman just listing it. I can hear you saying, could you just give me a list of the things that you've swallowed? Yeah. So when you go in to talk to someone like this, I don't know whether this was in your first interview or in a later interview, do you go in with a sense of, I think these are some things that I want to find out from her? Oh, for
sure. Yeah, very strategically. Mm-hmm. I mean, like, I think the best interviews, and you know that, I mean, you are a more seasoned interviewer than I am, but when we're thinking about at least narrative stories, like, we're very clear, we kind of know what the story is that we think it is, just from pre-interviews with people, you know, reading background materials, stuff like that. We have a couple theories of how it could go, even if we don't know exactly what people are going to say or what actually happened. And you kind of have a sense of and we'll talk about this, what scenes you need. Like, we need this person who witnessed this event to describe it for that place in the story. That's the person who's going to give us that scene, because it's a documentary and we can't just make it up, you know? So they saw that, they're going to give us that scene. Or these two people were there, and we'll create a scene out of both their voices going back and forth, you know, recounting what they did or what they saw or a conversation they had. And so in that way, we have that all planned out. We have literally like a list of, like, I need this from this person, and this is the question I think that's going to get it. But then I think really good interviews, like, as you know, like, also leave room for surprise.
Go places you hadn't expected.
Yeah, and so you have to both, like, be vigilant in getting the things you need, while also responding to things that surprise you, and doing that on tape, so that you're a stand-in for the audience, and you can actually say, "Wait, what? Really?" And the audience can hear you saying that.
Yeah, in a couple of pieces that I listened to of yours, I found it wonderful that you would say to someone, "You just laughed at that. Can you tell me why you laughed?" And it made me think of the difference between having an actual conversation with somebody, you know, that you know, where you might say that, but maybe not, and going in intentionally. It's a very different relationship, isn't it, that you have with somebody that you know you're going in to pull things out of them.
Right, because you don't want to assume why they laughed. Like, they laughed and I thought it was interesting, but I didn't want to have to be in a position later where I had to write, like, he thought this was funny, because I don't know if he was uncomfortable, I don't know why. So you might just ask him.
Yeah, in fact, the one that I heard was, I don't know whether any of you heard This American Life story, which is one of the most harrowing stories I think I've heard all year, which was Dos Eres, about a massacre in Guatemala, and that's where you ask Aura, this incredible woman who really investigated it.
Name.
I just listened to it this morning, so that's why I knew I was going to be talking to you. And I had heard it on the air in the spring, I guess it was on, but I wanted to listen again, and she talks about how she went to try to find the bones of the dead, and she laughs, and you say, "Why did you laugh?" And there's this wonderful moment where she says, because thinking back on it, I think I don't know whether she says I must be crazy, or, you know, she said, Guatemala.
Says, I was too daring.
I was too daring. In Guatemala, life isn't worth anything. And so she recognizes the kind of foolhardiness of pursuing something which could have gotten her killed. But it pulls out her humanity in a way that I thought was really
That was
powerful.
something I was just actually curious about, because I was like, why are you laughing, chuckling? You're talking
Right.
about going to dig up the bones of 200 dead people. So that was like honestly like just a gut question. But
Which I think is such an important thing as an interviewer, to follow that piece of what it is you're looking for. Another thing that I thought a lot about when I was watching the Life and Times is, in the work that we do lots and lots of interviews. We gather lots and lots of tape. I remember when I worked at NPR, the rule was 20 to 1, at least 20 to 1. So if you had a 4-minute piece, you had to have at least 80 minutes of, and usually it was much more than that. I don't know whether
80
you
minutes
have
of interviews.
80 minutes of interviews for the 5 minutes. If you were doing it, if it was a news piece and you were working towards a deadline, I would guess what you do, it's many more times than 20.
Yeah, I never broke it down to a ratio. Gosh.
Yeah, exactly. The
But,
quantifying is not a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, it totally depends on the nature of the story. But that Guatemala story, which ended up being an hour on the radio, I mean, we had to have 60 hours of tape, something like that.
Which I know
But,
filmmakers
yeah.
say the same thing.
Yeah,
The documentary filmmakers often gather hours and hours.
Yeah.
But when you were watching Life and Times, what was it like for you to see? I mean, here they gathered all of these interviews, and then they presented them all to us right there. So we got to follow the whole thing.
I had a really actually weird reaction to that in the beginning. It took some getting used to, because I'm so we do the exact opposite of what the Nature Theory of Oklahoma has done, which is to present every and its stutter, like start again, like in almost excruciating presentation to detail. Whereas I'm constantly cutting that stuff out. Seeing the words go above, I just picture looking at my logs of my interviews and just being cutting that out. And so they embrace them so interestingly.
In my first job at WNYC right out of college, I had to clean up somebody's interview and then leave it to be played. And I left the wrong tape. I mean, it was an actual physical tape. I left the tape of the and they played it. I mean, this was the early '80s, so I think
the ums and the uhs?
Only the ums and the uhs. It was
nice.
It was when things were on reels, and you put all the ums and the uhs on the outtakes reel. And I left that little reel instead of the reel of the interview, and they thought it was the guy who was interviewed he was not happy. But
they had a piece of experimental theater.
Yeah, they thought it was experimental theater. Exactly. I mean, it was the '80s, and so okay. But watching it, the part that I saw, the ums and ahs almost became more important than what she was saying. There were these, and I don't know whether other people felt that way, but there was a kind of musical way of using those. But I've heard, this may be apocryphal, but I've heard at This American Life, sometimes in the narration, the ums and ahs are actually put in, so that
in the narration.
Yeah, in the script that people write, so that that those things are okay. So
we leave ums and ahs on the tape for sure.
Right.
I mean, people talk that way. We're not trying to make people sound fake, but
yeah, exactly. I've been listening to all my own ums. It's made me very self-conscious about it.
Yeah, but we will speed people up if they take a long time. We will cut out. I mean, radio interviews, you do it within reason, but it has to happen in a certain amount of time.
And that's one thing I don't think everybody knows about radio. I think a lot of people think what you hear on the radio is actually what somebody said, and if you've got a reliable producer, it is. But often it's much shinier and prettier than it was.
Yeah, you make people sound good, and then also we'll ask people about the same topic at various points in an hour-long interview and put those parts together. Which is something else that didn't happen in this play. Everything happened exactly
right,
how people
as
remember
she said
it. Which, at doing interviews, that's what happens. People remember things about things later in the interview.
Right.
And in radio, we would condense those things into one part, basically, and explain them in one part, so you get the whole picture about that one topic or that one memory.
And it may sound like the person just brilliantly strung all those sentences together right there, but it's been.
No, yeah, of course, yeah.
For you, having watched the theater, you said things started coming up and it was a little uncomfortable at the beginning. What happened as you watched it going on?
I dug it. It was I felt like the one I saw was mostly not sung. There were a few songs in it, but it was still very operatic in that every word was spoken very dramatically and almost like it's crazy mystery. Did you guys see this one? Yeah. And I had the feeling, and often it was like a lot of it was about like high school and early high school, middle school. So a lot of it was about like trying to seem cool and like smoking cigarettes for the first time and first kiss and like wearing the right clothes and all that kind of stuff. And I felt like after it got going, like that dramatic performance of these kind of small and petty memories matched how dramatic those things felt when you
were going through them
back in the day.
I
feel
have a
like
middle
if you just heard
schooler
someone
at
saying,
home.
like, oh my god, like I just like smoked cigarettes and felt cool.
Yeah.
Like that doesn't match what the seriousness that felt like when you were that age.
And the emotional intensity, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that piece of it.
So I thought it was a really cool way to dramatize experiences we all have, but that gets smaller in our memory, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, or retain such power that you don't even want to visit them anymore.
Right. Yeah.
After years and years and years. I thought there was.
Yes.
Yeah.
Are you referring to a specific one that you saw?
Oh, let's see. I watched Birth through age 6, but no, I think I'm more thinking, don't tell my kids, but I'm thinking I have
What does she
two
say about her
teenagers.
birth?
She doesn't say anything about her birth, but she remembers.
First memory.
She remembers an image of, there it's very much like I would guess what images are. An image of her father holding up a diaper as she's getting changed on a changing table. So she's got that sort of, and it did make me think about, I have kids, and I was wondering, what do they remember from when they were tiny? Is there something that they can still hold on to, even as teenagers? So it was fun to think about that. I think I'm glad I didn't see the middle school and high school, because I'm reliving that through my kids. So that may be better off that I don't think about that right
I also
now.
thought that the very dramatic performance of the uhs and the ums, like at certain points she was clearly trying to remember things.
Yes.
And like that became a drama in itself. Like that was the tension in the play, was like her struggling to remember and using the uhs and the ums and the stutters to do that.
In the work that you do, the struggling to remember, I think, is something we all wrestle with. And I know for me as a radio producer, often we don't include that in the story. But in watching this, it made me realize it really is part of the story, because memory is so fickle and unreliable. So how do you...
And eyewitnesses are unreliable.
Yeah. How, in the work that you do, how do you... yourself and as a team talk about that, about you're asking people for stories sometimes about things that happened long ago. Maybe you can even talk about the one that's going to be on this weekend. I know you said you're working on a story right now.
It's hard. I mean, our rule is that we try to talk to other people who were there to try and just put together a corroborated account. But the one we're working on for this week is written by a woman named Amity, who is in her 30s now, but she's writing about when she was growing up. And when she was a teenager, her father adopted a 27-year-old man who had just been released from prison for killing his previous adoptive parents when he was 17. And so her father adopted this guy, Larry Swartz, who was kind of a famous murder case that happened in Maryland in the 80s. And he came to live with them. And so she's kind of writing about that experience, but also the fact that her father was an abusive guy towards her and her sister and her mother. And so there's some anecdotes and memories in there that are pretty difficult and very serious allegations against her dad, who's still alive and around, and she doesn't talk to him anymore because of this. And so we felt an obligation to get his side of
was he willing to talk to you?
Yeah, he was willing to talk to me. So I interviewed him on Amity's behalf and on the show's behalf. And it was hard because he denied any of these things. So it's like you've got her saying one thing, he's saying something completely different. And so then we went. Her mom didn't want to talk to us, understandably. And then we talked to her sister and a friend who spent a lot of time at the house, who did corroborate her memories. But she's talking about things that happened 20 years ago. So you got to try and find a way to present it in context and to kind of let people know why you believe this is true, and we believe it's true because we have 2 other people telling us they saw it. And then we also have in the story her dad denying it, so you can kind of make your own judgment. But
how do you this is complicated and difficult stuff. How do you go and talk to a guy who you think may have been abusive towards his kids?
It was really hard. That was really hard. I didn't know how, honestly. I mean, for a while, for a good hour, we talked about his adoption of Larry, the murderer, because he really cared about him.
Is Larry still alive?
No, he died. So that was how he enjoyed talking about that, and he did a lot of good things for Larry. Like, Larry brought out the best in this guy. So that was kind of that was the bulk of the interview. But then, we did have to turn to these other kind of allegations, basically. And so I just kind of said, I was like, Amity says these things, like, is that accurate? He said, no. I mean, he was more game than I thought he was going to be to actually talk. Like, some people just shut down an interview right then.
And we've had people actually leave the studio.
Yeah. I don't think I've ever really, when?
We always recorded things ahead of time, but we had one guy, I'm not even sure why he left, but it was in the middle of an interview and he said, I gotta smoke. And Kurt said, you can't in the studio. He said, all right, I'll be back. And he left and he never came back.
Really?
So, yeah. And I can't remember. We should have run it up to that point because there is some drama in that.
Yeah.
Okay. But I think we killed the interview.
Was he upset about questions you were
asking? I think he was upset. He was
or just had a very strong addiction to.
I don't know. Yeah,
cigarettes.
maybe right. He just was chain smoking outside and realized he couldn't come back. No, I think he was pissed off about something, but wasn't going to tell us and just left.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Do you have many things? I can imagine that you have to pursue a lot of things in order to get the stories that you have on the air.
Yes.
Do you find yourself going down a lot of dead ends in order to find the one that actually turns into something powerful?
Yeah, as a staff, definitely. I mean, we split that up, kind of, and we're always constantly looking for things. And I mean, like, it's not the most formal practice. Like people get ideas and you look into them a little bit and they don't seem as fruitful as you thought, or I mean, there's different levels of. People send us formal pitches that we consider a lot and then kill. Sometimes we start on a story and do a couple interviews and the people aren't compelling talkers and that's gone. Which is like I feel like people don't realize that about the radio, that like we interview or we like audition people. Like you could have the most interesting story in the world, but if the person can't tell it well or doesn't have ideas about it, like it's not going to work. I mean, imagine that this Life and Times, like you could take that idea with someone who's just not a talkative person, like that would never work.
And I'm not even sure Life and Times would work on the radio because
it just as theater, but the power of a person who's a good talker, at least in this medium, I think. Yeah.
And by a good talker, what do you mean?
Someone who's a good storyteller, who remembers details, who remembers like what things looked like, who remembers what people said, who has a sense of humor, who can make jokes, who doesn't feel practiced. Like they haven't told. Sometimes we'll have storytellers who tell stories for a living, and like they get into the interview studio, and you can tell they've told the story a bunch of times.
Right. Which is true. I know. I fill in for Leonard Lopate and have to interview novelists who often are telling me the same story, and it's figuring out how do you get a new story out of them.
Right. So Terry Gross is so amazing at.
Yes.
Like,
Terry's
someone's
the
on
master.
like a media tour talking every day about something.
Right. And on Terry, you'll hear something entirely different.
Yeah. So that's good. And then also, the other important thing is it's helpful that they have ideas about what the story they're telling. They have some thought about it, like what it meant to them, some moral or some question or something it made them think of, rather than just recounting events. So it kind of going to a deeper level than just this happened and then this happened. Right. And it's partly your job as a producer as well to ask questions that elicit that, but their ability to think of it that way is important. And that was one thing. I mean, granted, in the part of the play that I saw, it was just birth through age 6, so sometimes it's hard, or 8, to have those deeper thoughts. Did you find in the later part there was that other level in the story that was being told of kind of self-reflection? Yeah, I think so. There were moments where she was like, kind of just laughing at herself in the past, or talking about how important things were to her, or like there were moments where she was saying, "I think that really like opened the world up to me," and like could kind of explain why she thought that, and it made them feel important, Yeah. Like she could put it in context of her life and make it relatable. Like we've all had moments like that. One thing about the practiced
piece, I think, is getting more and more complicated as people are living their lives out loud in ways that they hadn't. I mean, I've been doing this for a long, long time, so there weren't blogs, there wasn't Facebook. Are you finding that this new landscape of people basically living their lives and telling their lives at the same time makes it more complicated, or do you find more stories that way?
I don't know, honestly. Like, I've only been doing it since that's been the case, largely.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. You think there's a difference? Like that's interesting.
I'm not entirely sure, but I've been thinking a lot about it because I watch my kids, and I watch the way, particularly my 17-year-old uses Facebook, and he uses it very differently than his friends. His friends will be like, "Oh my God, I saw this thing, and then I did this," and he like reflects on something that's happened, and then writes, 2 sentences about it. And so I've been thinking a lot about kids and the way that they, and you're almost a kid yourself, so you may be part of this too, but how you learn how to tell the story of yourself, which is really what you're asking people to do.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I don't know. It's a good question. It's a really good question. Ideally, you break them down. I mean, it depends on the form. Like sometimes we'll take someone who's written something online and work with them to write it for the radio. So they are writing something, and you're helping them, do something they're doing anyway.
Writing it for this form.
Yeah. But ideally, an interview hopefully will break things down, and we always want to, very rarely will we want to just do a cover version of someone's blog post. We want to dig deeper, and we have we'll only do that if we have more questions about it.
Right.
If reading the blog post. For instance, this story I was just talking about with the woman whose dad adopted the murderer. She wrote something that was pretty widely read online on Exo Jane about this. That's how we found out about it, through another producer at WNYC. But her dad isn't interviewed in that. He's not. Her dad of today isn't part of that piece. Basically, she talks about her memories of him, but his perspective is not in there. And that was what made us think, okay, well, we can add something to this. This is the guy who's just living in Florida. We can call him and ask him why he did this. Why the fuck would you adopt a murderer?
Right. Who had murdered his other adoptive parents.
Right.
Yeah.
So that was the driving question of that.
What's interesting to me, though, of what you said is that it was this adopted murderer who brought the best out of this guy. I mean, when you said that was like, ooh.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it's a weird story to describe, but yeah, basically he really related to him, and it was kind of he had to be good when he was around. He had to be a good dude.
To give him a role model of how to be good.
Kind of, and they were just friends. I think he just didn't want to act horrible in front of them. I don't know for sure, because he doesn't admit that he was ever horrible, so he doesn't talk about why he acted better, because he doesn't claim that there's a difference. But from his daughters, that's what they think.
Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about families, I mean, sometimes it's easier to be horrible in front of people who are related to you. Which is a terrible thing, but
he just really, I think it's a weird. Anyway, I don't need to get into all the intricacies of the story, but he was abused as well as a kid, and says that he thought about doing what Larry, the
killing
murderer, did, and so I think he just really saw him as a guy who, had the same urges that he did at one point. So.
When you work with writers, do you find that they're eager to add these levels? I guess every writer is different. I mean, I know as an editor, some writers are really interested in feedback, and other writers are like, no, it's perfect, don't ask me to change this. But it sounds like you really require people to make it something right for your show.
Yeah.
That's part of the agreement at the beginning.
Yeah, people seem pretty good about it. Really good about it, actually. I think it's mostly because if you're working with a writer, oftentimes they haven't done radio before, and so they're willing to be okay, well, yeah, I've never done radio before, so I'll submit to your suggestions here. I trust you because this is a different medium. So I think that buys us some leverage that way. But I haven't worked with anyone difficult at all.
So how do you find your stories?
A lot of them come from listeners or people who email us. And then a lot of them, so there's that level where it's they're not professional writers or journalists or storytellers. And then there's another level of just a bunch of reporters, radio and print, documentary filmmakers, storytellers, writers, and they kind of like we have a list that goes out to some of them, and also they'll just like we have relationships with them, and they'll email us ideas, and then like another percentage of them comes from like our curiosities about what we're reading in the news.
Well, I was going to ask you, like, you personally, what are you listening for and looking for when you, because I bet you're scanning the horizon for stories all the time.
Yeah. I'm still trying to get better at that. It's hard to find stories. It's like a
It
whole
is.
job on itself.
Yeah.
So like I'm no expert at it, honestly. Like, but like I just respond to good characters, and like I like plot, I guess. But like
Back to your theater background.
Yeah. But like things where there's just enough there are enough scenes, enough things happen to actually like justify a story, basically.
How many scenes does This American Life story usually have within it? Is there like an arc that you
could have
do?
one, I guess. It's like you need at least a scene and an idea at the end of it, and that could be a small top of the show, like a 5-minute interview, or 5-minute story. I don't know. I never thought about it in numbers really. But
so it's not like, all right, we've got to have our this and our this and our this. Each story is treated as its own.
Has its own conversation for sure. Yeah, definitely.
And it sounds like from what you're saying, there's a lot of conversation on your team. That this is a big part of it, is that someone will come with an idea and you'll kind of play with it, pull it apart, figure out, is this something for us?
That's why I actually think the being on this panel is kind of misleading, because it's about the everyman, but like there are so few people that we find we can actually do stories about, because it takes so much work to find a story that has the right person and who's gone through the right scenes, or the number of people who've gone through the right narrative and stuff. So it's really not an everyman. Like, it may give the impression of being normal people, and they are, but it takes a lot of work to find that one diamond in the rough.
Right, and that it is, the narrative of most of our lives is not going to make a great radio story.
Right.
So it is finding those, and what you've mentioned is the character, the right person to tell that story is a key part of it. And then the right story with enough drama and enough depth to be able to sustain.
Right, and also something you haven't heard before. Like, there's a lot of stories out there, and like it's got to be new.
Yeah, adopting a 27-year-old murderer is not one that I've heard before. So
right,
thank
we
goodness.
were even afraid. We were like, oh, too many people read this. Like, like it's been on the internet. Like, what can we add to it? So, like, even with that, yeah.
As you watched the play, in ways you started in theaters. So, what struck you about the way that it was produced and the way it was put together? I mean, this was sort of taking the work that you do now, getting people to tell their story, and now presenting it in an entirely different way.
I thought it was a really smart way to do it. I mean, I was like worried going in, quite honestly. I was like, oh, wait, what is this going to be? There's going to be, because I know what interviews are like. I know that like they're not that interesting all the time, and especially unedited, and and like I was totally engaged. Like, I just thought it was a really smart way to do it. At least the parts I saw. Like I said, like it just taught me things about our shared experiences that I hadn't thought about. And I thought it was cool to apply this level of like intense drama and like melodrama almost to stories that everyone experiences.
Memories
when
about
they're
high
kids.
school.
Yeah.
Well, I think what I'll do is open it up to questions. I'll get to take off my glasses and see you. Are there any questions from the audience for Brian?
Or Julie?
Or me? Yes.
I know that Brian is also worked at StoryCorps, which I think is particularly apropos to life.
That's true. That's a very different experience.
What do you want to know?
I mean, that seems to me truly the everyman. Anyone can record.
I know, but even that is a trick, because
I
know you guys know StoryCorps airs on Morning Edition on NPR every Friday morning. And what StoryCorps is an organization. It's an oral history organization that goes around the country and allows people to bring a loved one in or a friend and interview them, and then they get a recording of the full interview, and also a recording goes to the Library of Congress, and they've done many thousands of these. And then the best ones are edited down to like a 2 or 3 minute spot where it just feels like you're in this conversation on Morning Edition. So it gives the impression that like they're going around the country and just like people are talking and you're taking the best ones. But there's like a team of producers that is looking for interesting people to do these conversations that air on the radio. So like,
you mean going and actually finding the people to come into the booths
so that was like
to
my
tell
job.
the stories?
It would never you'd never be able to get enough stories to air every week if you just let people come in and talk.
So it's like, I know my Uncle Joe has a really good story to, you know.
No, it's like us like reading about like this guy who was involved with this really interesting historical event and wanting him to tell his story about this crazy fire that happened, or like, reading about, or getting pitches and like just like thinking about pairings that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Like there's a very aggressive effort to find the stories that will rise to be able to sustain even 2 minutes on the radio.
Mm-hmm.
So while it still is an everyman thing, you know, it's not like you can just dip like a fishing line into like America and like pull out a thing and have it be a story on the radio. At least I don't think so. Like it's really hard to do that.
That's so, I love knowing the behind the scenes. Like, you think it just happens, but somebody's worked for weeks.
And it also takes like a producer has to sit there a lot of it. Like, don't get me wrong, there are interviews you hear on StoryCorps that just happened. There are conversations that people had and they happen. Like, that definitely happens. But there are just as many where a producer either set it up and was there to guide them, because like you also like people don't know how to ask questions that elicit stories all the time. Like a lot of people will say the story to a person,
right?
You know, like so you went into the Marines and like had that whole adventure in Germany, right? And then the person will say yes, and that's not a story. That shut them down before they got to say anything. And that happens a lot when we work with print reporters too, honestly.
It happens a lot with I mean, and the other thing that happens a lot is well, did it make you feel this way or this way?
Right, exactly.
Which then narrows down what somebody's going to
at least
talk
give them
about.
a chance to come up with their own.
Right, with their own idea.
So like especially like people who are just like people coming in and talking, like they don't know how to ask first like radio questions, which is understandable. Who does? But you know, so as producers there and works out questions with them and jumps in even to help get the tape that you need to create something like that.
It's good. It creates work for radio producers. So that's an excellent thing.
Yeah.
What does make a good radio question for you?
Open-ended. I mean, a great radio question is like, what happened next? Like, that's a great radio question.
Yeah.
Like, probably the most important one. Then what happened? Or what else do you remember about that? Give me any other specific details you can remember about that experience or that time, or you know, I don't know. What are your good ones?
The trick one that I have two trick ones. One is if somebody's really reticent, often I share a story and then I get a story. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing that I do sometimes.
That's smart. Yeah.
And the other thing is at the end I say, well, you know, is there anything I haven't asked you about?
Yeah, that's a good one.
And often you get something that you never had anticipated, and then you're off
and the
into
other
something else.
Is to, like, not turn off the tape recorder after you're done.
Right. That's a really important one.
That stuff always comes afterwards.
Yeah.
Definitely. People
it was like,
things.
oh, I thought this was going to be so hard, and I didn't tell you about. Yeah.
Right. Well, people think it's like a serious thing, or like a formal thing.
Right.
And so they leave out the informal telling thing about their personality until the end, and so you have to leave it rolling.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Leave the tape rolling. Any other questions? Yes.
So both of you are seasoned interviewers at this point, and at some point I'm assuming you weren't. How did the experience of continually asking people questions change the way you actually meet people in your normal lives?
I think I always used asking questions as the way to feel comfortable. So for me, it was like, oh, you get to do that for work? So that was, I think that's always been my kind of mode. You know, it's funny, I'm sitting up here in front of lots of people and I am very comfortable now, but when I was young, doing something like this would have scared the shit out of me. And so it's, you know, we were joking before we started that I have the easy role here because I get to ask the questions. I mean, for me, it's much harder to sit in that seat. So I think for me, it was just kind of, that was the way that I rolled even as a kid. It's like, okay, if I ask questions, people will talk to me. So
when you hang out with a lot of radio producers, like I was at this radio conference in October, like it can actually get kind of annoying because everyone's like, wait, so then what happened? Oh my God, that's
I'm not going to tell you.
Wait, what do you mean by that? And my girlfriend is here, and she gets pissed at me when I ask her these things. Right? She's like, yo, we're just like watching TV right now. You don't need to ask me to go deeper on that. Like,
yeah, my kids get a little annoyed too.
yeah.
So. Although with my kids,
Yeah.
we started something called Two Truths and a Lie, because they wouldn't tell me anything.
Okay.
And so at dinner, we would each have to tell 2 true things that happened and 1 lie, and have to guess which was the lie. So
Great.
I don't think you
That's
should
your
do
way
that
of
in
sneaking out two
exactly
actual
two
things
things
that
that actually happened to them. I don't think you should do that in an interview, but maybe that would work. I don't
Yeah,
know.
that's
I don't know.
great.
Yes.
Question just about there's a fine line between, especially something like This American Life and journalism, and at what point do you need to verify facts with the people you're interviewing, and at what point is what they're saying more important than the facts?
Interesting. So you mean, like, so say if we're reporting a story or working with a reporter and we interview someone and they're telling us a story,
How much due diligence is done to research everything they're telling you, or is it?
a lot. I mean, like, you know, if you're reporting a long story, like, you're going to try to talk to as many people as you can who are involved in that. So, like, for instance, I worked on a story this summer about an undercover FBI informant who infiltrated mosques in Southern California. And, like, our first thing was, like, we were able to, like, someone gave us a list of everyone who had been his target, basically. It was, like, 26 people. And we were like, let's talk to as many people as will talk to us on or off the record. And when you start doing that, and that's like a process for most stories, like everything, you know, that one was a very clear presentation of here's a list of all the people who this guy interacted with and spied on. But every story kind of has that kind of like way that you can narrow down who is relevant to the story. And then you find that people start corroborating each other's stories. Like you talk to enough people and you end up like knowing what people are going to say, because like you just know, that's when you get to a point where you're like, all right, this happened this way. I've got a sense of the narrative. This is right. But yeah, you try to do your best. Like even with this story this week, we're like, okay, so this abuse happened within a family. Their mother is still married to this guy. Has told us she doesn't want to talk about it, is probably scared. So we don't have her. She's not going to verify that this abuse happened to her. So there's her sister, and then we were kind of like, is there anyone else around who saw some of this stuff? And, so we talked to this other friend as well who saw some, but not all of this. I mean, she didn't live in the house. But you kind of just do your best, and when things start adding up, you feel good about it. But it doesn't always work, as we've had experience with in the last year. So.
Yeah, that's right. You
Yeah.
were involved in the Mike Daisy, which I guess
Yeah.
isn't the same thing as corroborating.
Yeah, well, that was
That's-
a mistake we made, honestly, where we
Is not-
trusted someone too much. So.
So you didn't do the kind of diligence you do on all these other stories. And
I mean, we did diligence,
Mhm.
but when we were told that there was a person who could verify the exact like meetings he had, and he basically said like we couldn't reach her. Basically, we believed him. So that was like the one level we didn't do. Like all the things he said do happen, and we verified that in the world they happen.
Right.
They just didn't happen to
him.
And that was a lot of work verifying that in the world they happen. And we talked to like so many people just to be like, you've seen this happen, like all that stuff. Even that was a ton of work.
Wow.
Yeah. But in the end, like, one mistake and
It happens.
there it goes. Yeah,
And you learn from it and you do something else, I would guess, the next time.
for sure. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
My question is on technique. When you're having a bad day and you're just not very eloquent, what do you do in order to ground yourself and focus on what you want to get?
Wow. I luckily feel like I don't have to be that eloquent all the time, because like a question can be a little more like ideally in an interview you're not doing a ton of talking, like you do some bullshitting beforehand to like get people comfortable.
Yeah, that's an
And-
important piece of it,
Yeah.
actually, is
Yeah.
the schmoozing before you get started.
Yeah, so there's that, but you don't have to be terribly eloquent for that. You just have to be like kind of pick up on what they want to talk about and be friendly. It's a good question. I mean, it's not like a day. Like we'll prepare for a while. So like you at least if your day is not going that well, you have a list that you've drawn up draw on that, and you're usually collaborating with someone a lot of times. Sometimes not, but at our show we're often collaborating, so at least you have someone else to bounce ideas off of, and you're working together, and you're trying to articulate ideas to each other, so you don't have to do it in your head. So it forces you to say aloud what you're thinking. I don't know. What do you do?
Well, I was thinking actually last week. Last week I was called on Tuesday. Actually, first a friend emailed me and said, "I think Leonard Lopate needs a sick day." And an hour later, his producer called me and said, "Could you fill in tomorrow?" And so I said, "Sure." And I came in and I hadn't read any of the books, and I just read the press materials. And the first interview was way more complicated than I like to do without any preparation, in that it was about Iran, and it was these people who were making some really counterintuitive claims about Iran, and I knew I was going to have to confront them about the kinds of things that they were saying in their book, which is hard for me because I'm not usually a confrontative person, and I needed to do it calmly. And I did what I do when I get nervous, which is I went into the bathroom and I did these qigong exercises that ground you, that basically it's just stamping. Whoever came into that bathroom must have thought, what is going on in that stall? But it's a little different because when you're doing live radio, it's more like a performance, and so you have to be on. And that's, one day you might be able to. I never could have when I was your age, so it took me a long, long time to get to that point. But that's one of the little things that I've learned how to do, which is if I can ground myself, I usually can take whatever's getting thrown at me. And it's also getting in, when you do live radio, it's getting into that role of understanding, and maybe this is true for you too, that I'm not there to make the guest feel good, even though I do that a lot. I mean, that's part of what I try to do. I'm there to find out what a listener's going to want to find out. And so it's understanding the role, and that when I walk in there, I'm not Julie, I'm the radio interviewer. And so that what happens is not necessarily about me, it's about that role that I'm about to walk into. So that's my two pieces. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned that it's important to find people who are good talkers on the show, and I was wondering if you've had experiences where it's actually been helpful to have bad talkers on
Good
either
question.
interviews or on This American Life, if that's ever actually been an asset to the story you're
I'm trying to think.
tell.
I'm sure it has. I mean, there's sometimes where you get away with a bad talker because they're literally like, they're just so unique to their role in the story. Yeah. So like we did this story about the massacre. Like there were two soldiers who were there and took part in the massacre, and they could have been the worst talkers in the world, but we were going to interview them, and they were part of the story because they were two people who committed murder at a massacre, and they were going to talk to us about it. So there's that kind of thing where it's fine. I'm sure there are like ways you could like turn it on its head, like if it was relevant. I'm trying to think of an example though.
I'm thinking of one actually that I'm working on right now for Studio 360. Sometimes it isn't so much what a person says, but how they say it. I'm working now with this tape with this brilliant, crazy, almost unintelligible artist who was born in Argentina, grew up in Italy, and he decides he wants to make cities in the clouds. And so in ways, just the way he presents himself, he's not a great talker. You can't really get a great story out of him. But he is so enthusiastic and he is so excited, and everybody else in the story says, as soon as Tomas starts talking to you, you can't say no. And so in ways, you're using him more for the energetic thing than the narrative piece. So I wouldn't call him a traditionally good talker, but there's something about, he's just charismatic, and so that comes through even though you're not quite sure what he's saying.
I thought of an example that's the exact opposite on a story I'm working on that may not actually work. We're kind of evaluating right now, but we did a round of interviews on it. And we interviewed this guy. He's a former soldier who was in Iraq when we invaded 10 years ago. We're coming up on the 10th anniversary.
Oh my God.
And witnessed kind of the event that's kind of central to our story, which is the shooting of a guy on a bicycle, basically. And we're trying to figure out what exactly happened, and he was there. And you could tell he's just a very quiet guy. He doesn't talk much. He talks very slowly and does not like describing his emotions. You had to really ask him a ton of questions. And at one point, like an hour and a half into the interview, we went to his house, like rural Michigan, and it was pretty late at night. And at one point in the interview, he was just like, I have problems with emotions. Like I don't talk about my emotions very much. And then later he told us that he hadn't talked about this with anyone, except like a mention to his wife and a mention to his brother once in 10 years.
And that energetic piece in the story is probably really powerful.
So like if this ends up working, I think how we'll bring him on stage, I like that cut some of the tape to kind of figure out how it would work. I think how we bring him on stage is by him saying like I don't talk about my emotions much, and I haven't talked about this to anyone in 10 years. And so then you're kind of willing to forgive him the fact that he's not very loquacious and like it's hard for him to come up with this and tell it. You know?
And you're asking people to talk about things. I mean, all of the examples we've talked about today that are really painful.
I know, it's really a bummer. Damn.
But I can imagine a lot of people are that this is very hard for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard to understand because I've never been in that position of like telling a really horrible story that happened to me on the radio. So that's gonna be tricky sometimes.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes.
I guess this is more for you because you've been doing it for longer. Have you noticed general trends in how people verbalize?
I don't know. I mean, what I've noticed is, and this may be true for you too, the people who I find the most compelling are the ones who are the most self-reflective. And that can be complicated, as we were talking about before, in an age where it isn't so much, as you said, it's like you need to know what it meant to you, not just what happened. And so that I see a little bit of a change because everything is moving so fast that people aren't spending the time to think so much about what it meant to me. And so that would be the one thing. But that said, I think there's still a lot of people who do that. But I think that's what I'm listening for more than patterns of speech or the way that somebody tells a story. It's can they reflect enough on it, as you were saying, to get to that deeper meaning of why should I care about this story?
Yeah.
So, and I think that's just hard to do, and maybe getting harder because we don't have any time to do that, unless we're in therapy. I guess that's the one place where you get to do that.
Or a radio interview.
Or a radio interview, right? Where someone says, "Okay, tell." Yeah.
I think that's a perfect place.
Great.
Thank you so much, Brian.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Great audience.